Hey there, it's Art Stewart from Strategic Impact Partners, and this is What Matters Most on LinkedIn and YouTube. And our guest today is Michael Connor, who is a distinguished media executive, nonprofit leader, and all-around very versatile and accomplished guy. Some of his background that you can read in the post and on our YouTube channel includes publisher and editor of Business Ethics magazine, was a staff reporter in his early career for the Wall Street Journal, a correspondent and senior producer for ABC, and also served executive positions at Dow Jones Company and as an executive producer of the Wall Street Journal Report. And also a very small distinction for me personally, you were twice, Michael, a guest speaker for me when I was teaching my corporate social responsibility course at Emerson College. And that was like 10 years ago when you and I first got a chance to meet and get to know each other. So welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much for that kind introduction.
Well, I think it's important to kind of repeat what they can also read in your bio, because it underscores a lifetime of commitment to investigative reporting, investigative advocacy work. And it kind of all seems to me, getting to know you over these years, having culminated in everything that Open Mic that you're heading now, your organization that you created, stands for, and the kind of work that it is pursuing these days, which fits very much into what we are doing here at Strategic Impact Partners in the broader context of what we call corporate integrity. So I wonder if we could start with a little bit of a focus about Open Mic. And maybe it would be helpful if you just gave us a quick sort of summary of how you, at a certain point a number of years ago, realized you needed to put an anatomy around this advocacy work coming out of, certainly with the editorial aspects of Business Ethics magazine that then enabled you to grow it into the organization it is today.
Look, my background was largely in media and in journalism. I bought a magazine, Business Ethics magazine, which covers the field of corporate social responsibility. And another field that it covers is socially responsible investing. People who want to not only maximize the returns on their investment, but also think about social impact. And so in that socially responsible investing world at the time, and this was, 16 years ago now, socially responsible investing had been used very effectively in the area of climate change. It was having a big impact on people who were worried about the environment and climate change. And I got together with a number of people who, as we discussed it, thought that particularly technology and media would be another one of the big concerns. So what we decided to do was try to look to the field of investment and how one could be a responsible investor in the world of technology and media. At the time, most tech companies were considered to be the saviors. They could do no wrong. We've learned a lot in the years since. And that's been kind of the trajectory. And one of the things we do when you talk about journalism, my background, we try to make it fact-based. In other words, we are advocates, and what we do is we press, the mission is greater corporate accountability in the tech and media sectors. And we do that largely, but not exclusively, through shareholder engagement. So what we do is we organize, first we identify key issues, and then we talk to investors about those concerns. And then we try to engage with the companies. And over the years, we've engaged with most of the big tech companies, Apple, Amazon, Meta, Facebook, virtually all of them, including the telcos, Verizon, AT&T, on a whole range of issues. And so we organize the institutional investors to make the business case for better and improved corporate accountability.
Well, in our work at Strategic Impact Partners and in the corporate integrity space, as we have termed it, there's been the identification and the recognition of the very resourceful today and very impactful, what we call scrutiny industry, right? So, and in some ways, some of your advocacy work, working on shareholder proxies and proposals and so forth, could, I suppose, fall into that. I mean, it's a wide range of what we would consider typical organizations involved in that work. How do you think you differ from some of the more recognizable shareholder activism movements.
How do you mean that? Clarify if you can.
Well, in the sense that you focused a lot on the tech sector, right? And you focused kind of particularly around the impacts that the practices and the policies that the tech platforms have around key aspects to do with the user experience itself. And engaging with the shareholders of those tech companies, right, to hold the leadership and their feet to the fire in meeting, standards of good practice. It seems to me that your journalism background, the research, the fact-based approach, as you describe it, is not in the typical space of the scrutiny industry where you see a lot of these other high-profile shareholder proxy battles about hot button issues, right? I mean, the ESG industry has been getting a lot of pushback lately about some of that because some of those operators are not as thoughtful or as strategic as your approach. And I'm wondering if you sense that there's a clarification there in how you've approached it.
Yeah, but some of those people are my friends as well, and my allies. They may approach it somewhat differently. I don't want to create a dichotomy between what we do and what they do, or I'm not even sure if I'd agree with your term, the scrutiny industry. Look, there's a lot of ways of coming at this, and I think what a lot of advocates who are in the field of shareholder engagement are doing is simply saying to companies, look, there are a number of considerations. Environmental, social, and governance are key considerations. Our concerns, Open Mic's concerns in the tech area fall probably under the social, the S part of that, but oftentimes under the governance part of it, the G part of that. And I think it's important for most advocates and most of the folks that we do work with, ascribe to factual accuracy, and because we have to make the case not only to the companies, but we have to make the case to very substantial institutional investors. One of the things that's happened in the shareholder world, only 5-10 years ago, if you got 20 to 30% on a shareholder vote, support for a shareholder vote, you were doing well. In the last few years, that average has risen to above 30%, and in some cases, a majority vote at Apple, $1 trillion or so. That means some very substantial institutional investors are voting for your proposal, and they don't do that lightly. They have people who are looking at all these issues and all the arguments and evaluating the facts behind them. So I think shareholder advocates generally are trying to play fair and honestly. And the fact that companies often oppose these proposals, and more often than not they do, really that's we think a bad habit on the part of companies. Because companies often will tell you quietly, or some people within companies will often tell you quietly that they understand the point you're trying to make. And that one of the things that these shareholder proposals do is that they empower middle management or even elements of senior management to make the case to their board. In some ways, these kinds of arguments, you are the canary in the coal mine. You're telling the company that there's an issue coming up. And we've seen this. We filed, Open Mic filed, working with investors, shareholder proposals at Facebook probably 7 years ago now. Mm-hmm. And many of the things that we have talked to companies about are legitimate concerns that companies later recognize. We did a lot of work on facial recognition. Again, 5 years ago, I think it was. And everyone said, what is facial recognition? What are you talking about?
Early on, you've been involved. You saw the horizon clearer.
Well, that's our job. Our job is to talk about risks, among other things, and to talk about the risks that companies are taking on when they embrace some of these new technologies. And not only because we're not Luddites. We think technology can do great things, but we also recognize the harms. And all too often, tech companies seem to be in a race to introduce new products, almost at any cost, at any expense.
Well,
so we're trying to let them
AI, right? Let's look what's going on with. I mean, there's a lot of financial analysts that now are convinced we're not far away from an AI bubble at this point in the capital markets, right? I mean,
sure,
we seem to be in these shorter there are cycles of business. I mean, we've seen it with our ESG work, where a business concept catches on, it's being driven by regulatory changes or legal or risk management changes, and then people find business models that they can monetize, and there's just this big, huge swell of a wave that rushes into the beach, and everybody tries to get a piece of the action, and then then there's a fallout in a bubble, and whoever's left standing, I guess, are those folks that had done it the right way from the beginning, didn't over project the financial benefit. Let me touch a little bit on your process, because I appreciate the pushback on my scrutiny industry point, and to your clarification of how you folks are different. I think you sort of answered my question, because when I think about the approach you take, it is very strategic. It is very thoughtful. You try to approach the companies from a standpoint of collaboration. So reaching agreements and negotiating with companies, filing comments with government agencies, coordinating with stakeholders, filing proposals, sometimes for shareholder proxies and so forth. Explain how that's been evolving from when you first started doing the work years ago to the state of kind of accelerated us and them kind of battleground terrain that we're dealing with in our culture at the moment.
Boy, it's a tough one to answer. Well, if you look back only, say, 10 years ago, really, there was Google, and Google did a lot of things. And now you look at what a company like Google does. You look at a company like Meta and Instagram and some of the big social media platforms, and the impact they can have on society has grown so enormously. You talked before about artificial intelligence. We're engaged in artificial intelligence and concerns about how generative AI can affect misinformation and disinformation, for example. That was an issue that I don't think it wasn't in the lexicon 10 years ago. And now we have a product, ChatGPT in particular, but also other companies have similar products that are known to, quote, hallucinate. That's a technical term. They make up stories. I tried to search my bio on ChatGPT, and it ascribed to me all sorts of things I'd never done, but it also told me I had died in 2006.
Wow,
which was
pretty good for a dead guy.
I do, but my point is that if that same response had been given to a young person looking for a job, or a headhunter who was trying to fill a job, and it was making up facts and making spurious claims about somebody's background, and that has happened. Generative AI has accused or put forth as facts that somebody has committed a crime when it wasn't true. So you can imagine the harms of this. Anyway, my point is to your question. Now the challenges of keeping up with the technology are pretty enormous, and we're laymen. We can only follow some of this so far, and we work very, very hard to understand the technologies and the implications. We have our own sources, our own networks of experts. We rely on all sorts of groups to help us. But one of the big challenges is that the technology grows all the time, and it grows at a faster pace almost every day. And the other part of it is that all this technology has now raced, not just craft, it has raced into everyday life. So this technology is now in banking, it's in education, it's in healthcare. So if you're looking to make an appointment with a doctor, you've got to know how to finesse that. If you're trying to deal with your bank, you've got all sorts of issues there. So when you look at the impact that something like technology like artificial intelligence can have, it's affecting us all every day. And it's not just the tech companies anymore. It's banking companies. Any company with a broad consumer profile is really a tech company these days. So the implications are enormous, and keeping up with it is a challenge. Fortunately, more and more people are doing it. And now there are, again, compared to 10 or 15 years ago, there are a lot more academics, a lot more NGOs like us who are looking at the practices and trying to tease out the data and trying to see the real world implications.
How do you think over the years now doing this work to where we are today that shareholder or stakeholder groups have evolved? How have they shifted in their expectations of mobilizing around concerns that you've described?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, one thing to do first is to think about who are stakeholders, because oftentimes people will throw that out. And stakeholders are a company's customers, a company's employees, the communities where a company does business, and that can be a very local community, or it can be a national or an international community. It is regulators. It's all sorts of people. It is the environment. So when you I think 15, 20 years ago, the impact of employees on companies was felt, but now it's really quite profound. And it's one of the things that certainly big companies think about a lot. There was recently a survey done by IBM, which found that 68% of the employees who were surveyed would prefer to work for a company that was environmentally sustainable. And you see that especially with a lot of the young tech workers now. They do want to know that their company is doing the right thing, or at least trying to do the right thing, so that these concerns, again, back to your question, 10, 15 years ago, I think some of that was at work now, but now the data shows that employees are a very key concern for senior management of companies. But similarly, regulators, it's hard to do business these days without taking into account whether you like the term ESG or not. There are various kinds of reporting mechanisms in place that you have to think about. And if you don't think about it, you do it. You do that at your own peril, because the world wants to know more and more. Customers want to know. They have choices. They can buy a garment that's been made responsibly, or they can buy a garment that's been made in a sweatshop. And again, there have been many famous examples of that. And so customers can choose not to do business with you. So,
well, and that pressure too, if I might just inject here, that pressure is now increasingly being felt in the private markets with private companies and family-held businesses, and with their capital market partners like PE firms, because, as one example, you could be a privately held company in which 60% of your revenue is coming from one multinational public customer, a public company customer. And that public company has all kinds of adherences to ESG performance indicators that, if you happen to be lucky enough to achieve status as a preferred supplier partner, you have to align your business model with.
Yes, absolutely. And look, if you're a private company, your customers, as you said, maybe some of these big companies, and those big companies have made commitments regarding greenhouse gases and other environmental considerations. And so they want to know what their suppliers are doing. If you're a private company and you're also thinking about maybe an exit strategy being acquired by a larger company, similarly, a larger company is going to look at you and want to know whether you have met certain criteria. Are you a good corporate citizen? Because if you're not, that's going to hurt your valuation and your exit. So there's all sorts of reasons there, and regulatory. Increasingly, there is legislation or proposed legislation in states like California, in the EU, which would require companies, even private companies, to disclose some of this kind of information if you're large enough. So sure, there's a lot of reasons, even private companies. And this is ignoring the fact of whether or not it's the right thing to do. It's just whether it's good business to actually embrace some of these standards.
Well, it's also blowing out now to the underwriting world, the insurance underwriting world, which is going through its own transformation and its own kinds of financial and other material pressures. And so now even the insurance piece is filtering into ESG program considerations. One of the things that a lot of folks forget, when some people cringe, let's just be clear, we understand that some people cringe at this notion that we have long been moving fully into a new paradigm of Western capitalism, which is a multi-stakeholder model of Western capitalism, right? And you talked about the vertical categories, which are pretty fundamental and understood: customers, versus employees versus local community residents in a plant that you operate, versus political leaders and so forth. But what about the other aspect that folks don't always recognize readily regarding multi-stakeholder capitalism and multi-stakeholder relations is the fact that you can often have a multitude of those personas in one individual. You could have an executive that is at a local company that has been elected to the school board, who also has shares in that local company where their operating footprint is, and also resides there with their family, and some kind of event occurs that impacts folks materially in that local community. And all of a sudden, you've got one individual there who's a shareholder and a person of influence and a business person and a community resident. So you've got multiple personas in one individual. That is not so uncommon today in this notion of multi-stakeholder personas, right? So how much does that complicate, your work?
Oh, look, life's complicated, and that's what you have to address. There is a perception that companies are monolithic, and that the company thinks this way. And to a certain degree, it does, because it adopts policies and practices, and to a great degree, it does. And it has a board of directors who makes the final decision. But that's sort of what I was referring to earlier. But in a company, certainly a big publicly held company that has thousands of employees, they are all they all have other lives. They are husbands and wives and mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters, and they have kids in school, and they have their own personal interests. And some are white, some are black, some are gay, some are straight, and it's a complex world we live in. And we try not to assume that the people who work for a company necessarily agree. They are among the people we're trying to reach with the arguments that we're making, and oftentimes we find them receptive to that. And again, they're just people, and that in the world we work in and the world we live in, it's very easy to demonize companies and groups of people, and that's not an effective pattern for change. Having said that, one does need to be aggressive with companies because they are in some ways monolithic, having said that they aren't, but in some ways, yes. And they're very powerful. If you look at the companies like Alphabet and Meta, multi-billion-dollar companies with enormous resources who are doing some pretty terrible things. And so that the policies and practices that they often engender are wildly irresponsible, and we need to stop that. But yes, in the world of advocacy, you need to find your allies wherever you can find them. And it really is a complicated world that we live and work in.
And ultimately, you are in the consensus building business, right? When you are successful, you have built a degree of consensus with the critical parties at the table to move action. Has all of what you've just described changed the way you build consensus for any of these agendas you're working on?
Consensus building is long and hard work. Yeah. It does take a long time to do. It doesn't happen overnight because what you need to do, at least in our experience, in my experience, you need to develop trust, and you need to develop, we do a lot of work with one organization, and the CEO of that organization has used a phrase, if you want a friend, you need to be a friend. Right. And if you want an ally, you need to be an ally. And so what Open Mic does is we work in two worlds. One is the investment world. And so we have worked with sustainable investors, pension funds, faith-based investors, and all over many years. And we've tried to develop, and I think we have developed, strong relationships with them, and so that they can trust our judgment on issues. At the same time, we've developed relationships with a whole range of other what they call CSOs, civil society organizations, or social justice organizations, who often inform us about their concerns about key issues, whether it be the environment, whether it be about racial bias, sexual bias, a whole bunch of other concerns having to do with privacy. And they inform our work, and we try to be a bridge between the two. But building that consensus requires trust. It requires education oftentimes, because again, these are complex issues, technical issues, oftentimes involving in the world of technology, harms that are difficult to judge and to gauge. In the environmental world, one can talk about how much particulate matter came out of a chimney. In the world of technology, and when you're talking about privacy harms, it's much more difficult to grasp the harm, and it's much more difficult to talk about how you remediate that, how you fix it. Once you've invaded somebody's privacy and harmed them in that way, how do you fix it? And so, that whole process is difficult.
So I want to make sure that I give you a chance to touch on one or two of the key issue categories that you lay out as part of your mission on your website. So the issues that you have prioritized are technology and human rights, and you've been mentioning all of these in your conversation. Also, surveillance, capitalism, privacy and data security, biometric tech, open and affordable internet access, and racial and gender equity in technology. Could you just, in a snapshot, take one or two of those that you feel are particularly critical in the focus of your work at this moment, and why?
Sure. Let's talk, for example, facial recognition and biometric recognition, which, again, only a few years ago, people were wondering why you're raising a ruckus. And now I flew internationally recently, and when I arrived at the airport, the Customs and Border person insisted on taking my photograph on arrival in my own country. And facial recognition is now being used by airlines. It's being used by government, but there's also it's also being used in education. There are proposals to have facial recognition survey. There are companies that propose to have facial recognition technology survey the faces of children in a class, and they will tell you which ones are exhibiting, I'll call them concerning issues. I'm not an expert in it, but issues that should be of concern to teachers and educational administrators. Facial recognition and biometric recognition is now being used in the human resource process. It's being used to gauge whether, if I take a photograph, if I use the Zoom interview to determine whether or not you would make a good salesman. I think you would, but using facial recognition to determine that is a little bit scary. And there are very few. One of the terms that's often used in our field are guardrails. There are very few guardrails about how this new technology is being used. Another issue, one that we cut our teeth on many years ago, and which is now back in the news, is called net neutrality. Right. And in some ways it's complicated, in some ways it's simple. And it is that if you have a pipe, the pipe being the internet in this case, that pipe should be neutral, and everyone should be able to use that pipe on the same terms. The problem occurs when you have a company, let's say, for example, Comcast, which owns cable companies and is a cable provider, provides access to the internet, but it also owns broadcast channels, cable channels, all sorts of web properties. Can a company like that prefer its own businesses over those of others? Can it make some traffic on the internet go faster than others? Mm-hmm. So that's that can be a very complicated issue, but it isn't. It's really pretty simple. And it is that if there are avenues of access to the internet and affordable, very, very importantly, affordable access to the internet, then that should be done on an open basis. I could go on and on about all these issues, but those are two in a nutshell.
Well, that's great. I mean, we've unpacked a fair amount of material to get some brain cells charged up today. And appreciate that. It's Open Mic. Michael Connor, thank you for being with us. Art Stewart from Strategic Impact Partners. We'll see you next time here on What Matters Most on LinkedIn and YouTube.